So,
Wait.
comrades,
Excuse me.
in discussing the
This is
issue
distracting.
of...
Can you introduce yourself?
I'm sorry?
Can you introduce
Oh,
yourself?
my name is John Ryman. I do this blog site, oakandsocialist.com. I'm the former recording secretary of Carpenters Union Local 713. I'm an expelled member of that union. I was expelled for helping to lead a wildcat strike. Being 72, I could go on for another 15 minutes. So, we have to not only look at what is international solidarity, but we also have to look at why it is so absent, why it is such a lacking commodity, you could call it, in the socialist movement today. And you couldn't have a better example of that than the fact that you have this racist, Islamophobic, so-called libertarian, Philip Giraldi, speaking at this forum this evening. And this is not just an abstract moral question, because it is directly linked. Yes, we see like the heroic struggles of the working class in Iran and so on and elsewhere, but also we have to admit that we see the working class all throughout different parts of the world tearing itself apart. Just take, for instance, the attack on immigrants. You have in Costa Rica, attack on immigrants from Nicaragua. You have attacks you see something similar in India. We all know what's happening with immigrants or refugees in Western Europe, and I don't have to mention the issue of refugees here in the United States, both economic and political refugees. So, as I say, this is not just an abstract moral question. It is a very concrete question, and if we as socialists, if we want to address this issue, then we cannot do it without starting from the point of view of supporting, for instance, the revolution in Syria and opposing the counter-revolution there, which that is what is really happening there. And there are two main aspects, two main historical aspects of how and why this massive confusion has developed within the socialist movement here in the United States. And of course, in 10 minutes, you can only skim the surface of this. But first of all, an important development was the counter-revolution in what was then the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and the return to capitalism there. And there's some disagreement about was it a return to capitalism or not, but those are disagreements that we can have amongst comrades and discuss them as we go along. But the process through which I believe capitalism was restored was, it was very well described in Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, where it was just massive chaos. You had this whole mafia capitalists rise to the top, and it was actually similar to developments here in the United States slightly over 100 years ago, with the rise of what this historian Matthew Josephson called in his book of the same name, The Robber Barons. He was talking about people like Frick, Gould, Rockefeller, and so on. Now these people, for instance, they had their own private goon squads. They would go up to the state capitals and also to Washington, D.C. with huge suitcases literally stuffed with cash to buy legislators. They were just, they were absolutely open in what they were doing. And it was a similar process in Russia with the restoration of capitalism there. But the main difference was that 100 years ago or so, that was the rise of industrial capitalism, which for all of its brutality and cruelty and so on, it was actually developing the forces of production. Whereas now you have the domination of this parasitic finance capital, which is actually destroying the forces of production. So you have a totally degenerate form of capitalism today, and that is what came to dominate in Russia. And those gangster capitalists, that mafiosa in Russia, they picked one of their own who was absolutely indistinguished in any way except for his iron will and determination, and they put him at the top, the capo di tutti capo. And that was Vladimir Putin. And when Putin first came to power, he had no interest other than the interest of any self-respecting gangster to enrich himself personally. And he is widely considered today to be the world's richest man. But as time and events developed, then he saw, and not the least of which of those events was the Arab Spring. He saw that the Russian state, and himself at the head, they had to develop a base, a wider base in society. So you had, in 2005, Putin denounced the idea of a single state ideology. In other words, we don't have to have a state with a base, I'm just enriching myself. By 2013, he said, quote, "It is impossible to move forward without spiritual, cultural, and national self-determination." Those nice-sounding phrases are actually dog whistles for ethnic and cultural nationalism and fascism. And that is what he developed, in part through the Russian equivalent of the right-wing Christian evangelicals here, the Russian Orthodox Church. And just to do a little bit of self-promotion, I tried to summarize a little bit more in depth this whole process in this pamphlet here. So the second main aspect that we have to understand is the demise of the socialist movement here in the West, not least of which was in the United States. And in part that was an objective process. You had the degeneration of the Russian Revolution in the 1930s and so on, and the rise of anti-communism because the socialism left a foul odor in the nostrils of millions and millions of American workers. And you also had the post-war economic upswing, post-World War II, for those who were maybe of a different generation. And that really softened class relations in the United States. And there was another development. We have in the United States historic anti-intellectualism. And so if you combine all of those things together, what happened was that socialists tended to get largely isolated from the working class. And partly because of that and because of the anti-intellectualism, then you had in the 1970s, I remember this period well, the rise of the so-called New Left, which had this attitude that we don't have to think about all the old debates that racked the socialist movement. The first and foremost of those debates was this debate about what role would the capitalist class play in the colonial revolutions, which had just been going on and were going on at that time. And the Stalinists said, well, they'd have to play the leading role, and the whole issue of socialism has to be put off for some later date. Whereas actually the Russian Revolution, which set the example, it was the working class that played the leading role. The capitalist class could not play the leading role, and in taking power and in leading, it combined the colonial revolution with the socialist revolution. And incidentally, if you look at Syria and how the capitalist class developed there, they developed in part linked directly to the old semi-feudal landlord class, and in part directly linked to foreign imperialist powers, starting with the French. And so what happened by trying to escape these debates, the New Left came unconsciously to accept the point of view of the victor in those debates, which was that Stalinist bureaucracy. And without realizing it, even those who, in the abstract, rejected those ideas, in practice, accepted them. And a corollary of that is if you don't see the working class playing a leading role, then you don't see the working class as the subject of history. You see it as the object of history. And what happens to the working class doesn't matter. All that matters, or the masses of people doesn't matter. All that matters is the geopolitics. And that was the position and if you look at, for instance, the so-called socialists who support the Syrian counter-revolution, that is their position. We don't care what's happening to the masses of the people. They don't play any role. All we care about is U.S. imperialism. They don't even study the facts on that. Why, if you think about what theory is, it's just compressed history. And if you're not interested in history, then why should you be interested in the facts of recent history? So I think that there are three main things that we have to do in posing an alternative to these positions. First of all, we're working on this letter of solidarity that we would like to circulate with workers, unionists, and others in the United States. It's a letter of solidarity with the workers in struggle in Iran, and also with the struggle of women and oppressed minorities. And if people are interested, come and see me afterwards, please. Second, we have to carry on the fight to explain that the only division in society that we recognize is the class division. And we fight against all other divisions. And we see the independent role of the working class, that is the working class, that can resolve the other questions. Not that we put them in a backseat, but the questions of racism, of sexism, the environmental disaster. That it is only the working class that can resolve these issues. And finally, I believe that we have to link that. If we see the working class as being the subject that can resolve these issues, then we have to link that with the necessity for building a mass, independent, working class party in the United States, totally independent and totally opposed to all Democrats.